to talk a little bit more here about, I guess, the substance, Stefan, the substance behind this rally. And when you look at some of these software makers, when you look at some of these software services providers here, is there a use case there that is already apparent?
Yeah, hi, Romaine. First of all, thanks for having me on the show. And I think that's one of the exciting things about the software sector is they're an early beneficiary in terms of the top line. So we're seeing software companies embed generative AI into their products. Adobe last night was talking about it. Microsoft, of course, talking about it. And so by the end of this year, we should have products in the market with embedded Gen AI, and we should know what the monetization mechanisms are. The other thing that's exciting about the software sector is they're also key beneficiaries in terms of productivity gains. When you think of where the OpEx is for software companies, it's R&D and it's sales and marketing. Mm-hmm. With R&D, we see benefits in terms of software coding, software development, productivity through the use of co-pilots for coding. Mm-hmm. And then in sales and marketing, that's another first use case for Gen AI, being more efficient about selling, being more efficient about customer service. Mm-hmm. So the software sector as a whole benefits top line and bottom line.
Well, let's break down some of those sectors here. Talk about sales and marketing a little bit, because I think this is sort of one area where I think some people are wondering how much of a benefit is there really going to be. I feel like AI or something maybe similar to AI has already been incorporated into that space for some time, not necessarily well.
Yeah, so I attended the Salesforce AI launch on Monday here in New York, and they're embedding it within, across their CRM products. We worked at BNP Paribas Exane a couple of weeks ago. We published a large cross-sector piece of research working with 30 sector analysts to look at how this is going to be used across different industries. Sales and marketing was a key one. An example was in the catering space. A company we were talking to has a 6-month backlog in terms of new business. Mm-hmm. In order to pitch that new business, in order to respond to those RFPs, a lot of work needs to go in, months of work in terms of preparation, analysis, research into what those companies they're pitching are looking for, any problems they've had in the past. A lot of that can now be automated through Gen AI. So if you think about getting through a 6-month backlog of proposals in 6 weeks, of course it can have pretty important impacts on the top line.
Talk about the cost of this, particularly for those users, because when I hear some of these companies on the conference call talk about, the price points that they're offering right now, which is usually a few $100,000, at least for some of these big software firms, is there a cost benefit there for those end users that actually makes sense now?
I think so. I mean, we are still waiting to see the monetization mechanisms. Yeah. This is expensive to deliver. So for the software companies to provide this, there's going to be a cost, and that's why NVIDIA is doing so well. The infrastructure that's required to deliver these capabilities is costly. So it will probably be a separate charge based on consumption and based on usage. Mm-hmm. But some of the productivity benefits can be quite significant. Like I said, in terms of accelerating the demand on the top line, but also cost savings in terms of staff and efficiency.
There was a great story on the Bloomberg terminal this week about Microsoft really sort of being out in front of this. And they weren't always out in front of it, but they really have reasserted themselves, obviously, with the investment in OpenAI here. When you look at who are going to be the dominant players in this space, are we to look at the Microsofts, Amazons, and Alphabets of the world? Is that it?
I think so. I think they are amongst the obvious beneficiaries. Mm-hmm. They're all a little bit different. Mm-hmm. So in terms of those large language models, you mentioned Microsoft with OpenAI. Mm-hmm. That's a great partnership, but they don't own those large language models. They are OpenAI's. Mm-hmm. Yeah. When you look at Google, they do own those large language models through DeepMind, whereas Amazon doesn't necessarily have the large language models that the other two do.
Does that matter, the ownership?
We think it does. Mm-hmm. We think that we're already starting to see some enterprise customers gravitating more towards Microsoft Azure, a bit more towards Google Cloud, because they're seen to be having an advance here on the AI front. Mm-hmm. So we think that benefits both of them and potentially enables them to win some share against AWS. I think the other thing to highlight is Google and Amazon have the proprietary chips. Now, Microsoft is working on it, but Amazon and Google are ahead on that front. Mm-hmm. And then the final thing we look at is existing enterprise relationships, where Amazon and Microsoft are probably ahead on that front. So it's quite interesting, the competitive dynamics. We actually prefer Google amongst the three because they do have that full stack from the large language models down into the semiconductors. They have a more attractive valuation on 18 times earnings for next year. Mm-hmm. So that Google Cloud enterprise business that's currently break even is not really reflected in the valuation. And yes, they do have lower market share, but we think that this enables them to win market share going forward.
There's been a lot of discussion here about some of the companies that have incorporated AI into their own operations here, meaning the companies that are producing this stuff but mainly using it for their own business, whether they really need to go out there and sell it. The idea is, can they sort of create a business within their own business, if that probably doesn't make any sense. But you know what I'm getting at, the idea that they don't necessarily need to create a separate product. They can just kind of create for themselves. Is that sort of viable?
I think all of these companies since 2018 have been developing generative AI. So we think of this as kind of new. It has been around for a couple of years, but obviously has accelerated. And most of these large tech companies are already trying to find ways to use it internally. But of course, what's interesting is how do we get that to other enterprise customers? Last week in Paris, we hosted our BNP Paribas 25th annual CEO conference. We had 100 CEOs, we had 1,000 institutional investors. Of course, AI was one of the main topics. All of these CEOs, all of these companies are looking for trusted partners to enable them to implement this. And so I think a Salesforce, a Microsoft, a Google, if they can use this internally, show how they're using it, package it, and sell it, they'll benefit from it. I also think an Accenture, a Capgemini, of course, they're doing the same thing. How can we use this technology, and how can we show those use cases and sell it to our customers?
We only have about a minute left, but I do have to ask you about valuations on some of these stocks here. I mean, some of them, at least for certain cohorts, have gotten a little bit stretched. And I use that word stretch in quotation marks, because some people then would say, well, with the promise of what AI could deliver, maybe those valuations aren't as high as we think they are.
Yeah. So in many instances, we're still not back at those peak valuations for what it's worth. So we still have 15 to 30% upside for a lot of stocks back to those peak valuations. Microsoft is one exception. We're sort of hitting, those peak valuations we were at a couple of years ago. So I do think there's still scope for some of this multiple expansion to continue. I still think there's also a lot of skepticism. Again, we've been traveling quite a lot through Europe, through the US. A lot of investors are still skeptical. They may be scarred from the metaverse, scarred from blockchain and some of these technologies that maybe didn't take off. The difference here is we're seeing this more tangible, we're seeing this put into use more quickly, and therefore potentially more people will get interested in it as we go through the year and those products get launched and priced.